So I wanted to ask you about the experience of writing your most recent book, Earth. You lay out very starkly all of the evidence that climate change is happening right now, that we're living on a planet that looks quite different from the one that we have had historically. What was that like? How did it feel to lay out all of that evidence?
To write something like Earth it's tough because you're forced to really think hard about the extent of trouble we've caused ourselves. Now, I got to say, I got most of my real angst about all of this out long before that. I wrote the first book about climate change way back in 1989, The End of Nature. And that was a real struggle, and it was dark. I was, a couple of years of real, depression about, not clinical depression, but just sadness, powerful sadness. I've gotten over most of it, and that's, I think, one of the reasons I can be fairly effective as an activist on all of this. I've come to terms with the fact that we've done some bad things and that we're in a bad place, and so I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it now. I spend time trying to fix it up.
Are there still things that keep you up at night?
Oh, look, I've got a daughter, so one is, and the number of sad things that happen in any given day now as a result of what we've done to the climate are enormous. Not a day goes by when there aren't people someplace getting flooded out or drought spreading. There's price of food is up, grain is up 80% this year because we've had all this wild weather. That means there's billions of people who don't get enough to eat every day, and that's hard not to think about and be bothered by all the time.
Mm-hmm. Last week, in an op-ed in the Washington Post, you seemed to be expressing some frustration with the fact that many people in the United States are ignoring some of the evidence that's right in front of them.
Well, I think it's, the people who are ignoring what's in front of us are our leaders, and to some degree our media, although they're doing a better job as time goes on. It's mostly our leaders. The powerful are listening to the fossil fuel industry instead of to scientists. And it doesn't do any good to have this, incredibly beautiful thing, the scientific method. These people who we're getting a warning that we couldn't have gotten any other time in human history, and our leaders, who theoretically are supposed to be thinking about the future on our behalf, just are paying no attention. Yes, so sometimes one gets a little frustrated.
How do you, in the face of all of that bad news, how do you maintain your own sense of hope and
So I'm hopeful on the days that I am, because there are finally large numbers of people stepping up to try to do something about this. And all it took to sort of find that out was to start this 350.org thing and begin to just, it's not like we went out and organized everybody. There are 7, I'm a volunteer. We started with 7 full-time 22-year-olds as our staff, So we didn't organize the planet. We kind of sent word out that what we were up to, and all around the world people responded. We did last fall 7,400 demonstrations in 189 countries on the same day. That means there's a lot of people. And when I see their pictures, I'm always just taken aback at how beautiful and diverse and magnificent they all are.
How did you make that transformation from being a writer to being an activist? An activist.
Well, I'm still, I'm still mostly a writer. But when I wrote The End of Nature, I knew right away that I wasn't, that I had taken sides. I wished the world not to warm up, and was willing to try and work on it. So for a long time that meant speaking and so on and so forth. And in recent years, just I think because it became clear that no one was really organizing the kind of mass movement we needed, that I better not wait any longer for someone else to do it instead.
In your book, Earth, you say something about that there was a moment when something in you snapped.
There have been, there have been several. I remember being in Bangladesh, watching people die from the first big outbreak of dengue fever. And I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I got dengue myself and was as sick as I've ever been. This is a disease that's coming because the temperature's rising. And Aedes aegypti, that mosquito that spreads it, has expanded its range very dramatically. And I remember being in the clinic in Dhaka looking at all these people shivering from this tropical disease. And I remember just thinking, this is not fair. These guys have done nothing to cause this problem. The whole country of Bangladesh, 150 million people, you can't even get a number for how much carbon they emit. It's a rounding error in the international tables. Whereas, you know, the 4% of us who live here, you know, about 40% of the historical contribution of carbon to the atmosphere has come from the United States. So, you know, just seeing things like that makes one want to get out and try to make things change more quickly. Not that I had any real idea what to do, I didn't, but we've kind of made it up as we went along, and that's been kind of fun and interesting to realize that you don't have to wait for people with lots of wealth and power to sort of initiate change. You can do some of it yourself.
Are there things that you've learned about activism and about the political system since starting 350?
Well, one of the things that's become clear as we've gone along is that politics is about power. It's, for the most part, not about presenting persuasive arguments to leaders so they will then do what needs to be done. You've got to do some of that, but they've paid scant attention to those arguments because they're getting so much pressure from the very, very powerful fossil fuel industry. It's the most profitable industry on earth. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money, you know. And so what we've learned more and more is that you have to be kind of politically sharp. You have to push. You have to bring enough people and enough mobilization and things to get their attention. And we're not there yet. We're still losing to the Exxon Mobils of the world.
I want to ask, many of the strategies that you promote, both through 350 and the ones that you talk about in your book, are all about getting local, reconnecting to community. And your own background is a lot of the places that you have lived have been small communities.
Yes.
You live in Ripton, Vermont.
Yes. Is
there something about that experience of living in Vermont that has influenced your views about what the solution should be?
That's a good question. I think that it's probably easier to imagine the kind of solutions that we're going to need if you live in the big city or if you live in the country. I think it's hardest for the 50% of Americans who live in the suburbs to really sense what might change because the suburbs were set up as a kind of anti-community operation, you know. I was saying earlier, they're all about, you know, since the post-war period, our economy has been geared to the task of building bigger houses farther apart from each other. And the biggest effect of that has been to erode community wherever we were. If you're in one of those big houses isolated off on your own half acre, you're not with other people. In the country, you can be far apart, but because life's a little more rugged, you need other people and you seek them out, you know. And in the city, of course, people are just used to bumping into each other. They're not worried by it. It's part of the attraction.
That's interesting. And does your own experience of living in Ripton, does that help ground you and center you as you're working on
It's real important for me. It's real important for me to have easy access to the natural world, to get to be outdoors as much as I can. That's where I started thinking about these things in a way, is out in the woods, and it's good and calming for me to get there, you know, now. And I'm not sure without that if I think I might run out of steam at some point.
Yeah. You also have written in the past about faith and about the connection between faith and our commitment to the environment. Does your faith play a role in your activism now?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a, you know, in sort of practical terms, we've done a lot of work with faith communities around the world organizing, and that's really important. And it's really important in part because those communities are some of the few subversive, potentially subversive forces left in our society, you know. Faith communities are really about the only things left in America that could even posit some goal other than accumulation for human existence, you know. So potentially they're very subversive. And we do a lot of work with them. And in my own life, yeah, I mean, the very simple and powerful lessons I learned at Sunday school and then taught at Sunday school when I've become a Sunday school teacher are, you know, at the heart of this kind of work we do. You know, the gospel is remarkably simple in a lot of ways, you know. Jesus just keeps saying to the slightly dim-witted apostles, you know, just, it's love your neighbor. That's the point, guys. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the point now, too, as we try to deal with these huge environmental questions. If we're not able to do that, if we can't rise to that challenge, if we can't get past our kind of hyper-individual consumer selves, then forget it. We're not going to deal with what we need to deal with.
What's the most moving gesture or action that you've seen come out of 350? And I guess before I ask that, perhaps you could explain a little bit about 350 for anyone.
So 350.org is this big global climate movement that we've built from nothing in the last 3 years, and it draws its odd name from what the scientists tell us is the most carbon we can safely have in the atmosphere. And we chose that kind of wonky scientific data point as our rallying cry, mostly because numbers, Arabic numerals, cross linguistic boundaries in a way that words don't. And you know, there's no one, there's so many beautiful gestures, moments from that, from the 15 or 20,000 demonstrations and actions and work parties and things that we've organized over the last 3 years. One of the most beautiful, just physically beautiful things, we did this last fall, these series of 20 giant art projects around the world. We got artists to design images that we could execute with thousands of bodies on the ground in particular places. And then we got a satellite company to donate like $500,000 worth of satellite time so they could take a picture from 400 miles up, because that's how far away you needed to get to really see these. The one that really moved me was, they all did, but one of them was this dry riverbed in Santa Fe in New Mexico. You know, area that's right now trapped in a real bad drought, and this was a dry riverbed, and thousands of people showed up with blue. They dyed sheets blue or painted pieces of cardboard and things, and they got in that riverbed and held up these blue above their head, and suddenly from 400 miles up it looked like the river had just come to life, you know, it turned back into the real thing, and it was extraordinarily beautiful to see. A great gesture, and there were 20 like that day, and you know, huge, just thousands of beautiful things all over the world.
Have you seen those actions translating into actual political power?
Well, I mean, so far we're losing. We got to Copenhagen, the big climate summit, and we managed to convince 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target. So that was good. I mean, considering we'd had nothing in the way of resources, and it was, you know, a bunch of college kids and me, we were pretty pleased. But they were the wrong 117 nations, you know. They were all the poorest and most vulnerable ones, not the addict nations led by our own that weren't yet willing to do anything. So, you know, at this point, you know, the fossil fuel industry is ahead and we are behind.
You also talk quite a bit in the book about decentralization as a solution, or as a sort of way of being, a way of directing our society. We've seen a failure of climate legislation multiple times in Congress. Do you think that we're going to have a sort of federal policy level solution that will help move us in the direction of solving this problem, or no?
We're going to have to climate a federal and, in fact, an international policy level solution if we're going to have any hope of getting out of it. This is the first truly global problem that we've ever faced. And unfortunately, we can't community by community solve it. It doesn't add up in time to the kind of change that we need. That said, I think that once we do take steps towards solving it, once we do make fossil fuel pay the price for the damage it does in the atmosphere, will increase the trend that we already see towards a more localized and decentralized world. The world that we have at the moment is built on the back of cheap fossil fuel. It's made sense economically to centralize everything of a few big power stations that burn coal or whatever. The world we're moving to is very different. Sun and the wind aren't concentrated like fossil fuels. They're dispersed and diffused everywhere. And so the world that we build around them will be, you know, a world that looks very different. We'll have a farmer's market in electrons, just like we're building farmer's markets for food, just like the internet is a kind of way for people to both put in and take out information all the time. Very different from a few big TV networks broadcasting at you. That's what the future looks like, I think, and I hope we can get there.
What do you say to someone, I think that many Yes readers are pretty overwhelmed trying to think about climate change, and really anyone who reads some of the evidence feels really overwhelmed by this huge problem that's happening quickly, and it's easy to feel like you as a single person, you know, may not be able to
look. Climate change is the biggest fight of our time. It's the equivalent, you know, it's as mandatory as the fight against fascism was in the 1940s, you know. And just as, you know, just as that required people to work together, so does this, although this time on a completely global basis. It's easy to get overwhelmed by climate change because it is so big and we are so small. And nothing that we do as individuals can make a dent in the problem. That means we better not work mostly as individuals. We better work mostly as politically engaged communities that are willing to try and put real pressure on our leaders all over the world to make the changes that we need. Would that it were some other way. If we had 50 or 100 years, the right strategy would be education, slow cultural transformation, new habits spreading. We'd make a graceful and untraumatic transition to where we needed to go. Physics and chemistry don't give us that 50 or 100 years. They give us a very short window in which, at this point, not to stop global warming, just to make it worse, than keep it from getting any worse than it has to get. And so we need to work very efficiently and effectively, hence, say, 350.org, in an attempt to let people close to their home, doing things in their community, also have a real and powerful impact on national and international policy.
And if you're going to give advice to someone to do one thing, what would that be?
Organize. And the second thing would be organize, and the third thing also would be organize. And you know, after that, you can go change your light bulbs or whatever. Organizing is what it's about. And the thing I'm happiest with at 350.org is that we figured out ways to make it really easy for lots of people to become super effective organizers. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. It's not hard. It just takes commitment, and it's a good deal of fun, too.
Do you think that that fun, that organizing, helps people get beyond the fear and the overwhelm? Yeah.
No, look, sometimes people say to me that, you know, their kids seem overwhelmed by hearing about climate change at school or whatever. And I completely sympathize with that. And I always say, look, that's good. Get them. The reason they're overwhelmed is because they feel like there's nothing they can do about it. Have them be the leader, you know, among the leaders in organizing things for your, you know, this next big global day of action we've got coming. In this case, particularly, it's September 24th, 2011. It's all going to be based around bicycles. all over the world, because A, they're the one tool that rich and poor both use, and B, they're great for kids, you know. Kids all over the world are perfectly able to ride bikes and get out in the front of this movement. So that kind of thing empowers people, and that's important. That's what we need. The specialty of the fossil fuel industry is to try and make us feel disempowered, that we, you know, require them in order to continue our lives. We better figure out that we don't.
I think I may be at the end of my questions.
No more questions?
Yeah.
I was thinking it would be helpful, Bill, to say something about your relationship with Yes Magazine, ideas that you have about coming to town to be part of this event and celebrate this community.
Yeah.
Sure. So what a pleasure to be here with Yes at 15, which seems unlikely somehow. It still seems like a new magazine to me, which is good. I've spent my life in the writing business, so I know how hard it is to have reached, not only to have survived, but to have thrived for a decade and a half. And what fun to get to be part of the celebration of that. It's especially good for me because, you know, my instinctive response to the troubles we're in is always to say no. You know, I'm a good doer, New England, you know, Congregationalist by background. So, you know, so it's good to have some of this, for me to have some of the excellent, optimistic, hopeful Seattle vibe that comes through in the pages of Yes all the time. It's always a good corrective to my tendency towards gloom and all else. So many congratulations on getting here.